Welcome back, students. In this lesson, we're going to learn what imperialism looked like in the 18 and 1900s in the Middle East. And as you may have noticed, this lesson is going to be quite short. The world hasn't yet discovered the large reserves of oil that are going to make a lot of regions in the Middle East very valuable in the future. And so most colonial action in the Middle East right now is going to be focused on strategic placement to outmaneuver rivals. And Afghanistan is going to be a great example of this. In the region, we're going to see a big conflict between the British and Russia. As we saw in an earlier lesson, Britain had successfully colonized India, and this colony of India was making Britain a lot of money. In the meantime, the Russian Empire was slowly expanding its power southward, and as you can see on the map, it starts getting quite close to the British colony in India. Now, during this time, Britain and Russia had a serious rivalry going on. They even came up with a sensational name that sounds like something out of a Sherlock Holmes novel or a spy movie. They called it The Great Game or The Game of Shadows, and you can think of it as kind of like an early version of the Cold War, where Britain, with its democratic government, was in competition with Russian autocracy, meaning Russian absolute monarchy. Remember, Russia didn't go through an enlightenment, so their czar is still wielding a lot of power. They don't fight each other directly, but instead do a lot of maneuvering in other countries to try and outcompete each other, and Afghanistan is going to be one of those places. Afghanistan is this little gray country right here, and as you can see, it sits right between purple Russia and red India. The British, or more specifically at this time, the British East India Company, we've taken a little step back in time, so this is before the Sepoy Mutiny, and they're the ones running things in India, and they think that if they can gain control of Afghanistan, they can treat it as sort of a buffer zone to block Russia from threatening their very valuable colony in India. And so, the British invade Afghanistan in the First Anglo-Afghan War. This is another one of those war names that tells you exactly who's fighting. Anglo stands for English, and then Afghan for Afghanistan. And the British East India Company's goal is to quickly conquer the region and put a puppet ruler in place that they can control. However, as you're going to see in world history, Afghanistan is one of those regions that is a really bad idea to invade. It is extremely mountainous, which makes it really difficult to move armies through it, and provides lots of places for enemy troops to establish hideouts. This is something that British troops are going to really struggle with in the 1800s, and something that British and American troops are going to struggle with again in the early 2000s, when the US leads an invasion of coalition forces there as part of the War on Terror. History has a nasty habit of repeating itself, which is why it's always important to pay attention in your history classes. As kind of a fun example of how repetitive history can be, back during the 1800s, the writer Sir Arthur Conan Doyle created a super popular mystery series about the detective Sherlock Holmes. In the books, Sherlock Holmes' trusty sidekick is John Watson, a military doctor who is retiring after being injured serving in Afghanistan. A few years ago, the BBC created an updated version of Sherlock Holmes set in modern times, and in that series, John Watson's backstory is exactly the same. He is a military doctor who was injured while serving in Afghanistan. They didn't have to change the backstory at all. Initially, the British invasion of Afghanistan went well. They were able to pull off some early victories, and feeling confident, the British East India Company had the majority of their troops returned to India to protect that valuable colony. However, the British troops that remain in Afghanistan quickly make a nuisance of themselves. They drink heavily, stir up a lot of fights, and generally act disrespectful towards the Afghan people and their culture. On top of that, they are a foreign military occupying the country, which historically people tend to react pretty negatively to. In short, the people of Afghanistan don't like having a bunch of rowdy British soldiers conquering their country. In the cities that the soldiers are stationed in, angry mobs start forming, and out in the countryside, rebel forces start to get organized. Without being able to find safety in either the cities or the countryside, and not being able to win any pitched battles as rebel troops are able to easily hide in the mountains, the British lose their control of Afghanistan and are forced to retreat. This retreat is a particularly nasty one, Their path back to British-controlled India takes them through a mountain pass in the middle of winter. They run out of food as their supply wagons get stuck and have to be abandoned, and they're constantly suffering from sneak attacks from rebel forces. Only a handful of British soldiers make it out of those mountains alive. Britain still really wants control of Afghanistan as a buffer zone for Russia, so they give it a second try in the Second Anglo-Afghan War 30 years later, but this time they try a little bit more of a hands-off approach. Basically, they negotiate alliances with certain Afghan tribes, they give the tribes useful military support, but they allow the local tribes to actually run things in politics. After all, the British don't really want to rule Afghanistan, they just want Afghanistan to keep Russia out. This seems like a pretty good deal to their Afghan allies, so the local tribes control local politics, and the British Raj, the new British colonial government in India, handles all of the foreign affairs, specifically Afghan relationships with Russia. And that'll be the state of affairs for the next century or so. We'll check back in with Afghanistan in our last unit on the Cold War, because Russia's going to get themselves into a little bit of trouble there during that time. But for Russia during the 1800s, we also have a little bit of conflict surrounding another Middle Eastern country, the Ottoman Empire. If the Ottoman Empire sounds familiar, it is a very old empire. We're talking about them all the way back in like Unit 4. This is one of those powerful gunpowder empires. It's been around since the year 1300, meaning at this point in history it's over 500 years old and starting to get a little bit weak. It starts coming into conflict with the growing Russian Empire and gets into some fights with Russia over the Balkans and the Black Sea. It ends up losing those fights and Russia takes control of several small chunks of the Ottoman Empire. This worries some of the other Western powers, namely Britain and France. They see Russia as a growing threat, whereas they're not feeling particularly threatened by the Ottoman Empire. They're worried that if the Ottoman Empire collapses, Russia will be able to gobble up all of that territory and become much more powerful. Because of this, Britain and France take it upon themselves to become the defenders of the Ottoman Empire, sort of propping up this collapsing government, specifically so that Russia isn't able to take them over. Probably the most famous example of this is a conflict known as the Crimean War, which is in theory a war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, but the folks that the Russians are actually fighting are troops from Britain and France, like these very sharply dressed Highland regiments from Scotland who served in the British Army. They're headed over to protect the poor Ottoman Empire from big scary Russia to try and prevent Russia from becoming too powerful. So as you can see, there's not a lot of direct colonization or interest in colonizing a lot of these Middle Eastern countries yet. Once again, that'll change once folks figure out about oil. They're mostly being used as an area for countries like Britain and France to maneuver against some of their European rivals, namely Russia. Since there's not a lot more to say about that, let's go ahead and wrap up today's lesson. Take a moment to fill out your exit ticket and feel free to pop into Zoom if you need help with anything.